morning, ladies and gentlemen. I hope that you are enjoying your day off. It is quite cold out there. I wanted to begin with a pun. So, what do you get when you cross a snowman and a vampire? You get frostbite. There you go. All right, so I'm going to keep this short. I want to just introduce our final chapter that we will have together. We're going to be looking at questions of life and the church's response to them. Specifically, we're going to be looking at abortion, assisted suicide, and the death penalty. But in order to introduce this, I want to first talk about a concept Pope John Paul II introduced in the 1990s that's used very often in the pro-life movement. This phrase, the culture of death, which you will understand what that means at the very end here. John Paul II is going to compare the culture of death very closely to this right here, eugenics, which I want to just sort of briefly introduce to you guys just a little bit. So eugenics came about from something called social Darwinism. You may have heard of it before. So Charles Darwin writes The Origin of Species at the end of the 19th century, in which he describes the way in which evolution occurs through natural selection, survival of the fittest. The strongest animals with the best traits for their environment are the ones that are going to be able to survive and reproduce. Well, people began taking a lot of Darwin's ideas and applying them to human populations, arguing that some human beings are just genetically superior, some human beings are just genetically inferior to one another. This was actually very popular in the United States. So in the United States, it's not surprising that people believed that the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, the WASP, was at the top of the genetic ladder. They were the most desirable. They were seen as the strongest, the most fit for their environment. And then at the very bottom of the totem pole were Black Americans, which, if you know anything about American history, I don't think that's very surprising to hear that. People actually believed this was a science. There were people who believed that you could, look at the bumps on a person's skull and tell how intelligent they are, how socially fit they were, how superior or inferior they were. Supporters of eugenics, having this deeply racist view, believe that you should actually diminish the reproduction of some people that were undesirable. The undesirables should just sort of die off and not be allowed to reproduce. It's only the superior, the white Protestants, that should reproduce. This was seen in American anti-immigration sentiment in parties such as the Know Nothings, who wanted to block immigration. They wanted these non-white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. They didn't want them to come to America. They thought in some way that would make America less than. It would dirty the pure white race in some way or another. Of the immigrants that came here, right? A lot of them moving into the slums of the inner cities lived in some pretty terrible conditions. This is a picture from a book, How the Other Half Lives, looking at slum life of a lot of immigrant families around the turn of the 20th century. From the viewpoint of supporters of social Darwinism and eugenics, they thought people were poor because they were just inferior. They were just less than. Why would we support or help these individuals? Why don't we just sort of allow them to die off? Why don't we just let the weak become eliminated? They'll be better off in the end. We're getting near Christmas. Charles Dickens is A Christmas Carol. There's a scene where Scrooge, they've come in and they ask him for some money for charity. And Scrooge essentially says, why would I give money to charity? Why don't I just let the poor, why don't we all let the poor just die off? And then in the end, we'll be better off. Why keep just supporting the poor? If they die off quicker, the better off all of us will be. It's a very eugenic, very social Darwinist way of looking at it. And like I said, in America, very often those who were seen at the very bottom were African Americans. This is a political cartoon from that era. So it shows the WASP defending sort of the Rock of America. On one hand, they're going to throw the Irish off on one coast, and on the Pacific coast, they are going to throw the Chinese off It says what we'd like to see. There were some social Darwinist eugenicists that actually became very popular. Doctor, not really a doctor, Charles Davenport. Here's a nice quote from him. He says, "Two imbecile parents or two low-quality genetic parents, whether related or not, will only have low-quality genetic offspring." The implication is some people just shouldn't reproduce. Some people we should possibly, he actually advocated for them to be sterilized. That in the end, that would help us all off. Would sort of just die off. This was seen in Indiana. So Indiana, I've said before, had a very strong presence of the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan, their thinking is social Darwinist. Their thinking is eugenics. So it's not surprising to see this is the 1931 Indiana State Fair. You could go learn about eugenics. It's crazy. Now, eugenics and social Darwinism being so popular within the United States, the sad legacy of it, beyond just what happened in the US, is actually the Nazis picked up and read a lot of what Americans were saying about social Darwinism in order to form their own ideas. So the Nazis, they took eugenics to an entirely new level, right? They're measuring this guy's, the width of his nose as if that somehow is going to tell you how desirable he is. This is a really famous poster from the Third Reich. So it shows a handicapped man here, and it says 60,000 Reich marks, what this person suffering from hereditary defects cost the people's community during his lifetime. Comrade, that is your money too. Essentially, this person, because they are handicapped, they are going to need our support for the rest of their life. We're going to be having to pay for his support. The implication is, why don't we just sort of eliminate this person? If you know anything about the Holocaust, the first victims of the Holocaust were people who were handicapped, either mentally or physically. Sort of just get rid of the weak, and we will all be better off in the end. Now, thank goodness, no one today is a supporter of eugenics, unless you're like a crazy person in the Ku Klux Klan or something stupid like that, and you have half a brain. But Pope John Paul II has argued that a form of eugenics still continues to exist today in a different fashion. This is what he meant when he called our modern culture a culture of death. A culture that accepts that the best way to deal with the weak, vulnerable, burdensome, or unwanted is to have them eliminated, right? That in a new way, in our modern world, we still continue to attack the weak, the vulnerable, the burdensome, the unwanted, and that the best way to deal with them is for us to just simply eliminate them. It's not something based on race anymore, but it's based on just the fact that a person is weak or unwanted or vulnerable or burdensome. He argues that there's these following symptoms of the culture of death, a throwaway culture, where if a person doesn't provide you with something, they're kind of disposable in some way. Culture of extreme selfishness. If it's not meeting my needs, if you're not meeting my needs in some way, you lack value. A pitting of the weak against strong. Instead of the strong saying, how can we help the weak? The strong saying, how can we eliminate the weak? An obsession with ensuring efficiency, where we're only concerned with doing what we desire and doing it as easily and quickly as possible, regardless of what it means we have to do to people. You can think about in business, a business that only cares about profit and not about what they have to do to people in order to get that profit. Most concretely, John Paul argues the culture of death has led to the acceptance of abortion, of euthanasia or assisted suicide, of the death penalty, of indifference to the poor, and destruction of the environment. He argues in some way each of these is an attack on the weak. Abortion on the unborn who cannot advocate for him or herself, and assisted suicide. Someone who is in the last few months of their life who is suffering deeply, and we sort of are okay with them just being eliminated. The death penalty, where someone who has committed a terrible crime, it'd be best if we just eliminated them. Indifference to the poor. The fact that we live in the most wealthy country in the history of the world, yet we have people that go without the basic necessities, does that bother us? right? I think a lot of people are very comfortable, indifferent to it, or destruction of the environment. It's oftentimes the powerful who are exploiting the environment for their own needs, regardless of what it actually does to our Earth. And then who are the ones who sort of experience the cost of that? Oftentimes it's the weak, it's the poor, it's those who can't advocate for themselves. I want to point to this here. So, like I said, in general, people do not support eugenics today, thank goodness. Uh, you've got the UN Declaration on Human Rights from 1948. It declares all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Right? That's a monumental step for the United Nations to declare that. Beautiful. But John Paul points out, how can we say this? How can we say that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights whenever we accept these practices? Right? Is there not hypocrisy here? If we really support human rights, how can we accept these things? So I've got 3 questions for you. You can answer all 3. You can just answer one if you would like. You can do it however you like. I just want you to write 5 to 7 sentences. You can type them out. You can write them out however you want to do it. But do you think John Paul II is right? Do we live in a culture of death? Is that the right term to use? Is there hypocrisy within our culture when it comes to our declarations on human rights? Um, does a form of eugenics continue to exist today? I think that's the most interesting question. Is it eugenic for us to support abortion or uh, assisted suicide or the death penalty? Is it eugenic that we are indifferent to the poor or that we are willing to destroy the environment only for our own goals? Right? So stay warm out there, and I will see you guys on Thursday. Thank you.